He doesn't like strangers. Don't reach for him. Don't make eye contact. Don't even breathe too loud. Those were the first words Tanner Briggs said when he walked through the door of Cloverfield Animal Hospital that Tuesday morning. He said them to the room. To no one in particular. To everyone at once. The dog at the end of his leash was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 4 years old, maybe 5, with a raw patch behind his left ear and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. His name was Dusk. It said so on the tag, scratched and worn, hanging from a collar that looked like it had survived 2 deployments. Because it had. Opal Mercer was at the front desk when they walked in. She was 29 years old, a vet tech going on her 3rd year at Cloverfield, and she had a habit of noticing things that other people walked right past. She noticed the way Briggs held the leash, not tight, but ready. She noticed the way Dusk moved, close to the floor, watching the corners, pausing at the threshold like he was clearing the room before entering. And she noticed the way Briggs looked at her when she stood up from behind the counter, like she was furniture, like she was part of the building, like she was something he'd step around on his way to someone who mattered. She'd worked with enough military contractors and former operators to recognize the type. Not all of them were like that. Most weren't. But some of them carried their rank into the civilian world like it was a weapon they hadn't figured out how to put down. Briggs was wearing a gray Henley, dark jeans, boots that cost more than Opal's first car. No rank insignia, but he didn't need it. It was in the set of his jaw. It was in the way he stood at the counter and waited for someone to come to him rather than stepping forward to speak. "I have an appointment," he said when Opal approached. 9 o'clock. She pulled up the schedule. Briggs, Dusk, wound assessment and behavioral evaluation. She looked at the dog. Dusk was sitting with his haunches pressed into Briggs's left leg, his gaze moving steadily around the waiting room. There were 2 other dogs in the chairs, a golden retriever wearing a cone, and a small terrier mix trembling in her owner's lap. Dusk didn't look at them. He was watching the hallway door. "I'll let Dr. Feeney know you're here. It might be about 10 minutes. Fine." She started to crouch, not reaching, just lowering herself to his level the way she did with every dog, just to let them get a read on her without feeling towered over, and Briggs's voice cut across the room. "I said don't." She straightened, looked at him. "He's not a pet," Briggs said. "He doesn't want to be touched by people he doesn't know. He's been through enough without strangers getting in his space." There was a woman in the corner of the waiting room, mid-50s, reading a magazine with a basset hound asleep on her feet, who looked up at the sound of his voice. The front desk assistant, a 22-year-old named Perry, who'd been with them for 4 months, took a small step back toward the wall. Opal didn't move. "Okay," she said pleasantly, and walked back behind the counter. She wasn't offended. That wasn't the word. It was something more complicated than offense, more tired, maybe. She'd been doing this long enough to know that sometimes the humans were the harder part of the job. Dusk wasn't the one she was worried about. She pulled Dusk's file. He'd been registered at a base veterinary clinic in North Carolina through most of his working years, and the notes transferred were thin. The kind of thin that meant either everything had gone smoothly, or someone hadn't bothered to document. There was a mention of a noise sensitivity following an IED encounter 18 months ago. There was a flag for handler-bonded behavior, which meant Dusk had difficulty trusting anyone outside his primary handler, and there was a line at the bottom, added in a different handwriting, that said, "Retired MWD, placed with handler. Watch for anxiety indicators in unfamiliar environments. Military working dog, retired, living with the man who'd worked with him in the field." That changed some things. Not everything, but some things. When Perry called Briggs back to exam room 2, Opal followed, because she was assigned to Dr. Feeney that morning and Feeney moved faster with a tech in the room. Briggs walked in ahead of Dusk, and Dusk paused in the doorway again, that same threshold pause, and then entered slowly, his nails clicking on the tile. Dr. Feeney was already in the room, reviewing the chart on the tablet. He was 53, unhurried, with reading glasses he was always pushing up his nose. He greeted Briggs with a handshake and bent to look at Dusk without crouching. "How long has the wound been there?" he asked. 2, maybe 3 weeks. Briggs crossed his arms. It opened up again after he was in the yard during the rain. "I thought it would close on its own." Feeney peered at the patch behind Dusk's ear. The hair was gone in a strip about 2 inches long, and the skin beneath was pink and irritated at the edges. Has he been licking it when he can reach it? That would explain the delay in healing. Feeney straightened. I'd like to get a closer look. Opal, can you? She shouldn't touch him. Briggs said it immediately, flat, not a question. Feeney looked up. He's handler bonded, Briggs said. He won't let strangers handle him. He barely tolerates the exam when it's just you. I understand, Feeney said, in the same even tone he used for everything. But I need to examine the wound closely, and it'll go better for everyone, including Dusk, if Opal can help keep him calm. She can't. There was a short silence. Opal was standing near the cabinet on the far side of the room, not close to Dusk, not doing anything. She hadn't moved toward the dog. She was just there, present, quiet, watching. Dusk was watching her too. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not with alarm, just as information. He'd been tracking her since she walked in. Not the stiff, forward ears threat display she'd seen in genuinely reactive dogs. Something else, something more like assessment. Like he was running a calculation he hadn't finished yet. She looked away from him, focused on the cabinet. Feeney and Briggs went back and forth for another minute. Feeney patient, Briggs immovable, and then Feeney said, "Let me try the examination on my own. Opal, you can step out if Mr. Briggs prefers." "I prefer," Briggs said. She stepped out. She stood in the hallway and pulled out her phone and looked at exactly nothing on it for about 30 seconds. Perry walked past with a chart and gave her a look, the specific look that meant rough one, and she gave back the look that meant it's fine. It wasn't fine, exactly. But it also wasn't the worst thing that had happened to her at work. It was just a man who'd decided she was beneath his consideration, and a dog who'd been through something genuinely terrible and was doing the best he could with the tools he had. She understood the dog better than she understood the man. She usually did. She was halfway to the break room when she heard the sound. Not a bark, not a growl, something lower than that, a sharp, high keening that she felt in the back of her teeth, and then the unmistakable crash of something metal hitting the floor. She turned around. She was back at the door of exam room, 2 in 4 steps, and she pushed it open without knocking. Dusk was in the corner. He'd backed himself as far from the exam table as the room allowed, and he was pressed into the junction of the 2 walls, his whole body rigid and trembling, his lip pulled back, but not all the way. Not aggression, fear, pure fear. Feeney had taken a step back toward the cabinet. The stainless steel tray that held the examination tools was on the floor, instruments scattered. Something, probably the sound of it, had tipped Dusk over an edge he'd been standing on since he walked in the door. Briggs was trying to reach him, reaching the leash, reaching toward him, saying his name in a low, steady voice, and Dusk was pressing harder into the corner, vibrating. Opal didn't think. She sat down on the floor, not near Dusk, not close to him at all. She sat down in the middle of the tile, cross-legged, about 8 feet away, and she put her hands in her lap and she looked at the floor between them. Not at him, not away from him, at the space between. Briggs said sharply, "What are you?" "Give him a second," she said, quietly. She didn't look up. The room went still. Dusk was still trembling. His breathing was audible, fast and shallow, and his eyes were moving from Briggs to Feeney to the scattered instruments and then back to Opal. Stopping there, returning there, she stayed where she was, hands open, eyes down. 20 seconds passed. Maybe 30, long enough that she could hear Perry moving in the hallway outside and the distant sound of the golden retriever being called back to a room somewhere. Long enough that Briggs shifted his weight and looked like he was going to say something. Then Dusk took a step. Just one. Out from the corner. His head low, his ears soft, his eyes still fixed on Opal. She didn't react, didn't tense, didn't look up. Another step. He crossed the distance in small increments, not quickly. Nothing about this was quick, until he was close enough that she could see his ribcage moving with each breath. He sniffed the air in her direction. He sniffed again. And then, with a deliberateness that struck her as almost human, he lowered his nose and touched it to the back of her hand. She let him. He sniffed her palm, her wrist. He moved up toward her elbow, slow and methodical, the way dogs did when they were building a file on you, when they were deciding. She stayed still and let him decide. When he was done, he sat. Right there, about a foot from her knee. He sat down on the cold tile floor, and he put his chin on his paws, and he exhaled, long and slow, the breath of a dog letting something go, and looked at the middle distance. The room was very quiet. Opal looked up. Not at Briggs first. She looked at Feeney. If you want to try again, I can stay down here, low profile off to the side. He can check in with me when he needs to. Feeney nodded, already moving for the tools. She finally looked at Briggs. He was standing in the middle of the room with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something that was in the process of becoming something else, working its way through a transformation it hadn't finished yet. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the dog. Dusk wasn't looking at him. She looked away from Briggs, too. The examination took 22 minutes. Dusk flinched once when Feeney probed the wound directly, but he didn't move, didn't vocalize. He kept his eyes on Opal. She spoke to him a few times, quietly, nonsense, mostly, the kind of low, rhythmic murmur that wasn't about the words. And each time his ears would angle toward her and then relax. When it was over, Feeney prescribed an antibiotic ointment and a soft protective wrap that Briggs would need to change every 2 days. He explained it to Briggs while Opal remained on the floor, and Briggs listened, and the whole time Dusk stayed where he was, close to Opal's knee, not touching but near. At the end, Briggs bent and picked up the leash. He said the dog's name, and Dusk stood, but before he followed, he turned back to Opal. He put his nose against her wrist once more. A different gesture now, a different register, and then he walked to Briggs's side and stood there. Opal got up, brushed the wrinkles from her scrubs. "Is there anything else?" she started. "How did you know to do that?" Briggs wasn't looking at her exactly. His eyes were on the floor, on Dusk, on some middle point between. "He wasn't aggressive," she said. "He was scared. When a dog is scared, the worst thing you can do is keep moving toward them. You take up less space, you give them the choice. A beat." "He never acts like that with strangers," Briggs said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. It was the sound of someone trying to understand something that didn't fit into the model they'd been using. "He's not treating me like a stranger," she said, and then she picked up the folder from the counter and went to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "The wrap directions are in the discharge packet. If the wound gets any wider or you see streaking on the skin, bring him back before his follow-up. Don't wait." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out. She went to the break room, poured herself a cup of coffee that was already 2 hours old, and stood at the window looking out at the parking lot. Perry appeared in the doorway about 3 minutes later. "Did that dog just choose you?" "He calmed down," Opal said. "Opal, he laid down next to you like a golden retriever on a Sunday afternoon. That was not just calming down. He was exhausted and scared, and the floor was cold." She took a sip of the terrible coffee. "Dogs do that. They find the calmest thing in the room and they go to it." "Sure," Perry said. "The calmest thing." They stood there for a moment. "The guy looked pretty wrecked when he left. He's worried about his dog. That's not a bad thing. He was awful to you." "He was scared too," she said. She meant it. She'd thought about it the whole time she was sitting on that floor, actually. About how Briggs had come through the door, with Dusk held close and commands launched ahead of him like a perimeter. And how almost none of it was arrogance. Not really. How most of it was the specific terror of a person who had learned that their worth was defined by control. Watching the one thing they couldn't afford to lose start to unravel. How Dusk was the seam in the armor. How you could never be angry at the seam. She didn't say any of this to Perry. Perry would have had feelings about it, and she only had 6 minutes left on her break. Dusk's follow-up was scheduled for 10 days out. Opal saw it on the board the next morning when she came in, and she thought that would be the end of the story. That Briggs would come back with his guard up and his jaw set, and they'd do the follow-up, and she'd hand him a clean bill of health for the wound, and that would be that. But on the 3rd day after the appointment, she came out to the parking lot at the end of her shift and found a paper bag on the hood of her car. Inside was a coffee from the place 2 blocks down, the good one, not the chain, and a folded note. The note said, "He asked about you, or he would have if he could. I'm sorry I was an ass." No signature, but the coffee had been ordered black with 1 sugar, which was either a remarkable coincidence or meant that someone had paid attention at the desk when she'd ordered the same thing during an early appointment. She stood there in the parking lot in her scrubs with the bag in one hand and thought about a man who had spent most of his adult life in spaces where asking for forgiveness was a structural impossibility, who had nonetheless figured out how to leave an apology on a car hood. She thought about Dusk, pressing into the corner, choosing the stillest thing in the room, She drank the coffee on the drive home. It was the right temperature. It stayed warm the whole way. The follow-up, 10 days later, was different from the start. Briggs came in 5 minutes early and stood at the counter and said, "Good morning," to Perry, and then to Opal, with a quality of deliberateness that made it clear it was practiced, not in a rehearsed way, just in the way of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it. He held the leash loosely. Dusk walked in beside him and immediately turned his head toward the hallway that led to the exam rooms. "He remembers the building," Opal said. "He remembers everything," Briggs said. "That's part of the problem. He stopped, started again. That's also what made him good at what he did." She led them back. Dusk walked steadily, though he slowed at the turn into the hallway, pressing close to the wall. Threshold behavior. She noted it, filed it away. In the exam room, she crouched before she entered, before she was even in his sight line, so that when Dusk came around the door, he saw her already low, already small, already offering him the architecture of voice. He went to her directly. No hesitation. He put his face against her cheek and held it there for 3 long seconds. Behind them, she heard Briggs make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The sound of something leaving a pressure vessel that had held it too long. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" Briggs said. It came out flat, not inflected as a question, because people who had been afraid of an answer for a long time sometimes forgot how to ask it like one. The wound had healed cleanly. She'd seen it the moment Dusk came through the door, the way he carried himself without the low-held head that had marked his entry 10 days ago. The guardedness was still there, would probably always be there, a permanent feature of the landscape of what he'd been through. But the wound was closing. The skin at the edges was pink and new. "He's going to be okay," she said. She stayed crouched. Dusk leaned into her shoulder, all his weight on one side. Feeney came in and did the assessment in 12 minutes. He declared the wound healed well enough to leave unwrapped and set a final check for 3 weeks out, mostly precautionary. He was efficient and kind, as always, and then he left them. Briggs put the referral paperwork in his jacket pocket. He stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, not quite leaving, not quite staying. "He was assigned to me on my second tour," he said. "Not to Opal exactly, to the room, to the fact of Dusk standing beside her, leaning. They train them with one handler when they're young, but they're supposed to be able to transfer. That's the theory. He never transferred right. Every new handler, he shook his head. By the time they gave him to me, they'd tried 4 other guys. 3 months in, I thought they were going to wash him. But he found his footing. Something crossed his face. He was the best partner I've ever had." Opal didn't say anything. She knew when a space needed to stay open. "When I got out, I requested to bring him home. It's more paperwork than people expect, getting a working dog out. Took 8 months. And then we got here and everything is," he gestured, vaguely, "at the room, at the civilian world, at the whole architecture of a life that didn't fit the animal they'd both come from. He has bad nights. I have bad nights. We work around each other. That sounds like partnership," she said. He looked at her for the first time directly, the way he hadn't done once in the first appointment. "You do this for all of them?" "Do what?" "See the thing underneath." She thought about it for a moment, seriously considered the question rather than deflecting it. "I try," she said. "Dogs are usually pretty clear about what they need. They're just not always able to say it in a way that people recognize." She looked at Dusk's, who was still leaning against her shoulder with the contentment of a dog who had made his decision and found it sound. He needed someone to get smaller. That's all. He needed the room to feel less dangerous. "I should have known that," Briggs said quietly. "You know everything else about him," she said. "You were in it with him. Sometimes the hardest thing to see is the thing you're too close to." He nodded. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded. When they left, Dusk turned at the door and looked back at her. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he turned and walked out beside Briggs into the light of the parking lot, and she stood in the doorway of the exam room and watched them go. Perry materialized from approximately nowhere, as Perry always did. "He was nice," Perry said, the tone of a person reporting a genuinely shocking development. "He was fine," Opal said. "He said thank you when he left. Actually said it. Like meant it. People can change," she said. "Some of them just need a reason and a minute." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, and she went to reset the exam room and thought about Dusk's face at the door, the way he'd looked back. Not to check that Briggs was following. At her. Just at her. She had a theory about dogs like Dusk, about what it meant when a dog who had been through what he'd been through turned toward you without being asked. When they chose you. It didn't mean you were special. It didn't mean you had done something extraordinary. It meant you had made yourself safe enough for something wild and broken to approach. It meant you had remembered, in a room full of noise and fear and metal on the floor, that the most useful thing you could do was take up less space. There was something in that for humans too, she thought. There was something in that for all of it. She put the examination tools back on the tray. She smoothed the paper on the table. She washed her hands and went to find out what came next.